Hello and welcome everyone, and thank you for being here with us today for this impact workshop on demystifying greenhouse gas scope 3 emissions. So today we'll have a short overview of scope 1 and 2, and then we'll take a closer look at scope 3, which cover indirect emission across the value chain. And I'm very happy to introduce Afshin, who is actually here with us for the first time, and I hope not the least. And he's an expert in environmental commodities and voluntary carbon markets. I'm not going to say any more, and Afshin, the floor is yours. And we have 1 hour together, and it's your time.
Sure. Thank you so much, Claire, and good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for joining. So today we are going to look at the Scope 3 emissions. The everything that's I'm going to share today will be the GHG Protocol standard, which is basically the rule of law, as I call it, for the GHG accounting. GHG are as you can see on the screen, are the gases of the CO2, CH4, N2O, HFCs, PFS, and SF6 and NF3. These gases are the gases that we are trying to reduce and emit as much and reduce from the whole productions globally. So this has been divided into three categories, but as normal as we hear is that the most focus is on the CO2 emissions that everyone are looking forward to take care of that. So we'll first review, as Claire mentioned, we will first review scope 1 and scope 2 to establish a clear foundation. I understand that we have a variety of the listeners here, so I try to if I will be mentioned so many things or trying to pass so many things, I'm trying to make a balance between everyone. So at the end of it, people have a good understanding of these scopes and also can uh, or be willing, interested for the other sessions that we can have further about the scope 3 calculations and with more examples. So we'll move into scope 3, which includes the 15 categories, as you guys can see in here. And we will just my question. You guys can see my mouse is going up and down, right?
Yes, we can see
Yes.
it.
Okay, great. So we'll have the scope 1 and scope 3 and the scope 3, which is divided between the upstream and the downstream activity of each company. And we'll follow on that later. So let's start. We will have the question why scopes exist. To understanding the scope 3, we must first understand why emissions are divided into scopes. Under the GHG Protocol corporate standard, companies must define their organizational boundaries and their operational boundaries. As I can say it in easy terms, it will be whatever happens inside your house and whatever relates but outside of the house. This would be some easy explanation, but of course we'll explain it further. The operational boundary is where scopes are defined. Scopes classify emissions based on the relationship between the company and the emission sources. They are not ranked by the importance. That's a really important one. They are categorized by control and ownership. So, for example, if a company burns natural gas in a boiler, it owns that boiler, those emissions are direct. If it consumes electricity generated elsewhere, those emissions are called indirect energy sources. If emissions occur in the production of materials it purchases, those emissions are indirect and part of the value chain, the supply chain, or as we know it. So the scope structure ensures transparency. I need to I forgot I needed to go on the airplane mode. So if as I was saying, if a company burns If emissions occur in the production of materials it purchases, those emissions are the indirect part of the value chain. The scope structure ensures the transparency that we need and avoids double counting within a company's inventory. It also allows the companies across the value chain to report emissions consistently, as we need to compare the companies and categorize them. So it allows to verify the emissions in the same sector too, which will be important for the scope 3 on the higher levels. So going on to the slide 3, organizational boundaries. Before assigning emissions to scopes, a company must define its organizational boundary. The corporate standard provides three approaches. First, the equity share, the which under this method, a company accounts of emissions according to its percentage ownership in an operation. For example, if a company owns 40% of a joint venture, it reports 40% of that venture's emissions. Second is the financial control approach. Here, a company reports 100% of emissions from operations over which it has financial control, meaning it can direct financial and operational policies. Basically, they own. And the third will be the operational control approach. Under this method, a company reports 100% of emissions from the operations over which it has operational control, meaning it has authority to introduce and implement operational policy, like they have the smaller companies underneath of them, and they can mandate their policies. The choice of approach directly affects what is included in scope 1, 2, and therefore what remains in scope 3. This step must be defined clearly before the classifying the emissions. So when we are going to the slide 4, the operational boundaries, scope 1, 2, 3, if I would say it as the definitions, once the organizational boundary is defined, the company establishes its operational boundary. Under the corporate standard, scope 1 emissions are direct GHG emissions from sources owned or controlled by the company, like any company. It would be SME, big or small. Anything that they own will be their scope 1. Normally, one of the biggest ones is their buildings that they own and the emissions related to having that office space, or if they have a factory. And the scope 2 goes to the emissions are indirect GHG emissions from the generation or purchased electricity, steam heating, or cooling consumed by the company. Basically, whatever electricity your company is buying, or if you guys are the steel or the cement, you guys might purchase the heat from another party. So these will be included. And then the scope 3, the emissions are basically on the scope 2, we have just on the parentheses. On the scope 2, we have these energy attributed certificates, which are the definition of how you can purchase those certificates for defining your scope 2. For example, each consumption per year of the annual consumption of your company, if you're based in Europe or anywhere else in the world, you will buy the certificates from the renewable energy generators per megawatt hour, because the electricity that you guys are buying is from the grid, and there are a variety of producers in the grid that creates a mix of the grid. So you want to define that, okay, from this year, we consume 500 megawatt hours, and based on that, we want to buy 500 megawatts of certificates from wind, solar, or hydro in France, as we're here, and the company exists here. And yeah, these are the way of using it. And of course, on the scope 3, emissions are other indirect emissions that occur in the value chain, the report of the reporting company. So for example, if a company owns trucks and burns diesel fuel in those trucks, that is scope 1. And if the company purchases electricity for its office building, emissions from generating that electricity will be a scope 2, basically. If the company purchases steel, emissions from the producing that steel are a scope 3. And the defining principle is, as I told you before, is the ownership or control of the emissions source. So going to the slide 5, here I'll delve into the scope 1 a little bit in detail. Let's clarify the scope 1 more precisely. The corporate standard identifies four main types of scope 1 emissions. First, stationary combustion. This includes fuel burn in equipment such as boilers, furnaces, or generators, or owned or controlled by the company. For example, burning natural gas in a company-owned heating system, which is normally in France. Second, mobile combustion. This includes fuel burn in company-owned or controlled vehicles. So, for example, you have diesel used in a fleet of delivery trucks owned by the company, like Amazon. And third will be the process emissions. These result from chemical or physical processes, such as emissions released during the cement production or chemical manufacturing. And the fourth, fugitive emissions. These are unintentional releases, such as refrigerate leakage from air conditioning systems or methane leaks from pipes. These are the ones, as we call them, the hidden gems, because it's normed that companies forget about them, and each time we need to tell them, do you guys own refrigerators? Do you guys own the air conditioning systems for your companies? So which will be depending on the companies, it could be in the variety. So the central rule is simple. If the company owns or controls the emissions source, the emissions are scope 1. Upstream fuel extraction is not scope 1. Purchase electricity is not scope 1, would be a scope 2. And the third party transport is not the scope 1. It's again, it would be a scope 3, which will be your supply chain. Scope 1 is strictly direct emissions from owned or controlled resources. These first 5 slides establish authority and structural clarity. And they set you the transition into the scope 2 and 3. So now we are going to the scope 2, my favorite, to be honest. So scope 2 includes indirect greenhouse gas emissions from the generation of purchased electricity, steam heating, or cooling consumed by the company. These emissions physically occur at the power plant or energy facility, not at the company's site. Unless if you guys are really big and you own some assets that you will have your own electricity generation, or like Elon Musk is thinking to having their own power plants, like if it would be with the nuclear, small nuclear reactors. So, but the general idea is this. For example, if a company purchases electricity for its office building, the emissions from generating that electricity are scope 2. If a manufacturing plant purchases steam from a third-party provider, emissions from that producing steam are scope 2. And according to the GHG protocol, introduced additional guidance regarding the dual reporting of scope 2 emissions. Companies must make sure about this part. It looks simple, but it could be, as they say, the devil is in details, and it could be painstaking. So first is the location-based method that on this one, this reflects the average emission intensity of the grid while the electricity consumption occurs. For example, electricity consumed in France would reflect the average French grid emissions factor, which is almost 75% zero emissions, although there are some speculations regarding the the zero and the green electricity, but basically because France is using its nuclear fleet that's providing a really healthy generation of electricity. Although if we look at the Norwegian or the Nordic countries, over there they are almost 99% to 100% green electricity, and basically their whole production will be counted as a green. But still, they need to calculate their consumption and mention it. And the second will be the market-based method. This reflects emissions from electricity that the company has contractually chosen through instruments such as supplier-specific contracts or energy attribute certificates. So this market base will be whatever your company consumes. You, as I mentioned before, for example, 500 megawatt hours your company had consumed in, I don't know, in Belgium. And at the end of the year, you will, calendar year, basically, you will go and mention that, okay, it was my consumption for this year, and I want to mention it on our reporting. It would be preferably would be the up to the April. I mean, country by country is different. For example, the Germany is until the late July that they have to put this period of the reporting. But generally, the idea is 365 days per period. So, but we need to be sure that both these numbers must be reported. It is important to clarify that transition and distribution losses from the purchased electricity are not included in scope 2. They are reported under scope 3, category 3, that they will take care of it. So we are going to the slide 7, transition to scope 3 and why it exists. Scope 3 includes all other indirect emissions that occur in the value chain of the reporting company. So as you can see by the category around 2024, 9% has been the purchase goods and services, and 2% has been the capital goods, almost 0% was the capital goods. It would be different by the companies, but it's a general understanding of the companies consume. Fuel and energy related activities not included in scope 1 and 2 are basically one of the interesting ones because there is a fleet that changing towards the electricity in Europe, and that's one of the approaches that we are seeing in Europe. But the most is the use of the sold products. Basically, whatever your company produces, the emissions that will be created by that will be all over the world until that product dies or returns to your company. So meaning the term die or it becomes expired is that when it goes back to the recycling places or as it will be done, totally will be basically dead. Like the phone that you guys are having, by the end of its cycle, it's still a brick that you guys have and it needs to be recycled. So with that, scope 3 includes all other indirect emissions that occur in the value chain of the reporting company. The scope 3 standard states that for many companies, scope 3 emissions represent the majority of total emissions, around 75 to 80% of their emissions. And scope 3 was introduced basically to provide a more complex picture of the climate impact beyond own operations and purchase energy. For example, a car manufacturer may have relatively modest scope 1 emissions from its factories. So basically, most of the car manufacturers in Europe are taking care of that one. But from the use of the cars itself, the fuel burned by customers. I know. Thank you. But emissions from the use of the cars itself, fuel burned by the customers, would fall under category 3, category 11, and the use of sold products. Similarly, a retail company may have limited scope 1 emissions, but emissions from the producing the goods it purchases and sells may dominate its footprint. So Scope 3 expands the boundary from operations to the full value chain, upstream and downstream. Okay, so going to the slide 3 and slide 8, an overview of the 15 scope 3 categories. So I'll just go through them and I'll explain each and every one of them as we'll see. But basically, the scope 3 standard defines 15 specific categories so we can understand and calculate it better. They are divided into the upstream and the downstream emissions. Upstream will be 1 to 8, which we have in here, and the downstream emissions that we are having here, basically emissions from the distribution sold products, from customers using sold products, from disposal of sold products at the end of life. Each category has a defined boundary in the scope 3 standards, and the companies must assess which category are relevant to their activities and take care of those reporting. So let's delve into these categories. So I merged them. It would be easier to understand. So categories 1 and 2, purchase goods and capital goods. So category 1 is basically purchase goods and services. This includes the emissions from the production of goods and services purchased or acquired by the reporting company in the reporting year. So, for example, if a company purchases steel, plastics, consulting services, or even IT equipment, emissions from producing those goods and services are included in the category 1. So basically, whatever those companies are taking care of the scope 1 or scope 2 or scope 3 will relate to us. So we are somehow, you understand that we are somehow related to each other. I'll explain it later, of course. So, and this includes the emissions from the production of capital goods purchased or acquired in the reporting year. So capital goods are long-term assets such as machinery, buildings, manufacturing equipments, or vehicles. So for example, if a company builds a new factory and purchases industrial machinery, emissions from producing the cement, steel, equipment are included in the category 2. The distinction between the category 1 and the category 2 follows the financial accounting definitions. Both categories represent upstream emissions from production processes not owned or controlled by the reporting company. We need to always note for this one. So then we are going to another category which I really like, and that's fuel and energy related activities. So category 3 includes fuel and energy related activities not already included in scope 1 or scope 2. This category captures emissions across the life cycle of fuels and energy consumed by the company. It includes emissions from extraction, production, and transportation of fuels burned in scope 1. So for example, if your company doesn't have fuel and one of your trucks is out of fuel and someone got to go and to the pump station get some fuel from that one, this goes to this category. Of course, it's not it could be for some companies exceptional situations, but for some would be so random. So and the other one goes for the I'm sorry. Okay, so it was emissions from extraction, production, and transportation of fuels burned in scope 1. Wait a second. So, I'm sorry, I need to repeat what I said. So, this category captures emissions across the life cycle of the fuels and energy consumed by the company. So, it includes emissions from extraction, production, transportation of fuels burned in the scope 1, emissions from the extraction, production, and transportation of fuels used to generate electricity consumed in Scope 2, and transmission and distribution losses of purchased electricity. This is a really important one, especially for the grid companies and electricity companies, for the losses of the electricity that they need to include. So, for example, if a company burns natural gas in a boiler, Scope 1 includes emissions from the combustion, but emissions from extracting and transporting that natural gas are reported in Scope 3, Category 3. Same thing. If a company purchases electricity, it could be direct electricity or power purchase agreement, which are the contracts which you have with your electricity provider. Scope 2 includes emissions from generating that electricity, but emissions from extracting coal or gas used to generate that electricity, as well as transmission losses, fall under the category 3. Of course, for the nuclear, it's much low, but if your consumption is high, you will obliged to take care of that. There is a percentage, if I believe it's plus 1%. So that will you can ask that number from your grid provider. Category 3 basically ensures that part of the upstream energy life cycle is captured beyond direct combustion and generation emissions. So we can say that nothing will be hidden in this process, and we can measure and calculate them and put it in our reports. So going to the categories 4 and 9. So transportation and distribution. This is pretty much straightforward. Categories 4 and 9 basically address the transportation and the distribution that occur in the value chain are not owned or controlled by the reporting company. Category 4 is upstream transportation and the distribution, which includes emissions from the third parties transportation and warehouse of the purchased goods. For example, if a company purchases raw materials and those materials are transported by a third-party logistics provider, the emissions from that transport are reported in the category 4. If the goods are stored in a third-party warehouse where reaching the company's facility, emissions from operating that warehouse are also included in the category 4. But for the category 9, this is the distinctive part. It's just the downstream and the distribution. This includes the emissions from third-party transportation and warehousing of the products sold by the company between the point of sales and the end customer. So this is just the difference. It's what before the client and after. This is all of it. For example, if a manufacturer sells products to retailers and third-party carrier transports the goods, like it could be Maersk through the sea, it could be the other truck transporting companies, those emissions fall under category 9. The key principle that, again, we shouldn't forget, and that's the key to understanding everything, is whomever owns this process, benefits from this process, have to report it. So basically, ownership is the control. Ownership or the control is the one that you need to always make sure. If the company owns the truck, the emissions are Scope 1. If a third party provides the transport, it's Scope 3. And okay, I hope no one is tired, and it has been almost 30 minutes. So we are on the slide 12, going for the categories 5, 6, and 7, waste, business travel, and employee commuting. So yeah, just to make you guys sure, it's almost 6, 7 slides more, and at the end we have the Q&A. So waste, business travel, employee commuting. You think that the wasting the companies are not important, but trust me, those are important, as each company are generating the waste, and here and there, I mean, in the office space, that's not much, but especially in the factories, that's a considerable amount, especially if those are not going through the recycling processes. So the category 5 is waste generated in operations. This includes emissions from disposal and treatment of waste generated in the reporting company's operations when handled by the third parties. Most important one. For example, if a company sends manufacturing waste to a landfill or incineration facility operated by another entity, emissions from that treatment are included in the category 5. Category 6 is business travel. So all the travels that people who are employed doing with the business travel, usually if it's in France, it would be with a train, or if it's within Europe, I highly advise please use the trains as are one of the best means of the transportation. But of course, sometimes we don't have a choice. It's a last minute call and you need to be in Munich the next day, so you have to get a train, get a flight. So for that one, we cannot hide the fact that there are emissions coming from the long haul flights, and those are considerable, especially if you're counting the amount of the emissions that are being emitted by the airplanes are massive. At the end, I'll bring the statistics for each flight, yeah, but of course, we all know comparing to all the terms, the shipping and the flights are the highest. Going for the category 6, this, of course, will be the emissions from transporting of employees for business-related activities in vehicles not owned or operated by the company. So even the Uber that you guys are getting will be counted. For example, if an employee takes commercial flights, trains, or taxis for business purposes, those emissions fall under category 6. And the category 7 is employee commuting. Basically, this includes the emissions from transporting of employees between their home and work sites. For example, if employees drive personal vehicles or take public transportation to work, associated emissions are reported under category 7. In all three categories, the company benefits from the activity, but does not own or control the emission sources. Okay, so now we are going to the slide 13, and the categories 8 and 13. Basically, is pretty much straightforward. Leased assets in the upstream and the downstream. Categories 8 and 13 are leased assets and classifications depending on the organizational boundary approach selected before. So category 8, as I mentioned, is the upstream leased assets. This includes the emissions from the operation of assets leased by the reporting company when those emissions are not already included in the scope 1 or 2. For example, if a company leases a company space but does not have operational control over the building's energy systems, emissions associated with operating that leased asset may fall under the category 8. You need to check it with the company, but that's the rule of thumb. Category 13 is downstream leased assets. This includes the emissions from the operation of assets owned by the reporting company and leased to the other entities. Those emissions are not included in scope 1 or scope 2. For example, if a company owning office spaces and they are renting them, that would be that. Or if a company owns equipment and leases it to the customers, and these emissions from operating that equipment are not already reported on the scope 1 and 2, they all include in the category 13. The treatment depends on whether the reporting company has operational or financial control over the assets. The standard is clear on this. Emissions must not be double counted with the same inventory. That's one of the most important ones. So we are going Slide 14, categories 10 and 11, processing and use of sold products. So category 10 is processing of sold products. This applies when a company sells intermediate products that require further processing by third parties. For example, if a company produces a steel that is later used by another manufacturer, for example, in the automobile manufacturing, emissions from processing that steel into vehicles are included into the category 10. As I told you, we are all connected. So category 11, on the other hand, is the use of the sold products. This includes emissions from the use of goods and services sold by the reporting company during their expected lifetime. For many companies, this category can represent a significant share of total emissions. For example, if a company sells gasoline, NL, or the what is the total, par exemple, emissions from combustion of that gasoline by end users are reported in category 11. So it's really important for the total that the fleet that they are selling their gasoline will be the least possible producing emissions worldwide. So that's an interesting thing, that why they are trying to always keep their quality, so the production of the emissions through their gas will be always on the controlled levels. If a company sells electrical appliances, for example, LG, Samsung, emissions from electricity consumed during the product's lifetime are included in their category 11. These emissions occur after the point of the sale and from sources not owned or controlled by the reporting company. So basically, if if they buy those products for themselves, it's another category, but whatever goes outside of the door of the company to be used, that will be their category 11. So now we are going to slide 15, category 12, 14, and 15. End of life, franchises, and investments. This is also one of the categories which I really like because they are always challenging. So category 12 is the end of life treatment of sold products. This includes emissions from disposal and treatment of products sold by the company at the end of their life. For example, if a company sells plastic packaging, emission from landfill, recycling, or incinerating that packaging at end of life are reported under category 12. Category 14 is a franchise. Just an example for the previous one. For example, all the Avignon bottles that we are having and we are using, the end of the life cycle that they are having is really important. And because of that, they are pushing to having their plastic bottles to be recyclable more and more. And of course, one of the reasons why in Europe they have came up to having the cap of the bottle being attached to it, one of the reasons was the whole thing will be together so it could be processed. Otherwise, there would be going other ways and you will not be sure where that bottle cap have been gone. That has been one of the reasons, but not the main one, of course. And the other one is going to the franchise, is that franchise, this includes the emissions from the operation of the franchise not included in scope 1 or scope 2. For example, if a company operates under a franchise model and franchises operate facilities not under the company's operational control, emissions from those facilities may be reported under category 14. So any of the McDonald's franchises or other companies that do the franchising, whatever that contracts that they have will be the emissions of the main company too. They would be the the franchises company, it would be their direct emissions, but for the main company, it would be the category 3. And as with all of these, wait a second. I mentioned about the franchise and okay, so I'm just repeating. Category the 14th was for the franchising, and category 15 is investments, so financial companies. This includes emissions associated with the reporting company's investments, such as equity or debt investments. For example, if a financial institution holds equity in a manufacturing company, emissions associated with that investment may be included in the category 15 of the company. So even if your company doesn't is not a manufacturing company, but your company hold the equity in a manufacturing company, those emissions will be related to your company. So the consistent principle, as long as it's not included in the scope 1 and 2, of course, but the consistent principle across all 15 categories is this. Scope 3 captures indirect emissions across the value chain that occurs as a consequence of the company's activities, but from sources not owned or controlled by the company. This will be straightforward that you always can have in mind, does the company own it or it doesn't own it? Is it within the facilities or outside of the facilities? With these, you can easily differentiate that. So now going to the a little bit of the calculating scope 3 methods. So in this one, now let's take a look on the scope 3 emissions, how they are calculated. So we have basically almost 4 methods. So the scope 3 standard describes several calculation approaches. The 4 most commonly applied are first one, the supplier-specific method. This uses the primary data from suppliers on the actual emissions associated with a product or a service. For example, if a company purchases aluminium, like the French Belgian company, they the supplier they purchase the purchase of the aluminium, and the supplier provides verified cradle to gate emissions per ton of aluminium produced. The company multiplies the tons purchased per that supplier specific emission factor. This emission, this approach basically reflects supplier specific performance and is generally considered higher quality when reliable data is available. One of the most important things that we always need to make sure is that those data of the emissions that the people from the environmental department are calculating and processing and collecting through the sensors or through the machines emission assumption production numbers. Those are really important, and if, as we say, if we have the correct data, we can have the correct analysis, and we can have the correct missions based on that, and we can take care of those. So everything starts with collecting the most accurate information from each company, which, as I told you, the companies are connected and becomes bigger and bigger and bigger. Just you need to take the first step right. Okay, so this approach reflects supplier-specific performance and is generally considered higher quality. The second one, not saying the other ones are not have a high quality, but some companies have the issues that they cannot collect the emissions correctly because they have a vast value chain. For example, one of the most problematic the companies will be for the Amazon, that they need to take and collect the emissions from all over the world, mostly the one of the main suppliers in China, and those are also developing to provide the information. The hybrid method, this combines supplier-specific data with the secondary data. For example, if a company receives emissions data from its top suppliers but lacks data from smaller suppliers, it may use supplier-specific data that are available and apply industry average emissions factors for the remainder. So it says basically one of the options that companies can use is use these data using supplier specific data. For example, there are some nominated companies within the same sector that they will provide and mention if this company is small and this range of emissions will be produced by this company. And if it's bigger, will be more emissions, depending also on the location of the companies too. And the third, and one thing we need to mention that the industry average emissions are one of the most important ones, which each industry can calculate it and provide it, and that's a norm. The third one is the average data method. So for this, uses industry average emission factors specifically. So if a company purchases office furniture and does not have supplier-specific emissions data, it may multiply the quantity of furniture purchased by an industry average emission factor per unit of the product. As easy, you just have the emission average and you multiply it and you know what percentage of the CO2 per ton you will have. And the fourth will be the spend-based method. This method multiplies the economic value of goods or services purchased by an emission factor per unit of currency. For example, if a company spends 1 million euros on marketing services and uses an emission factor expressed as kilograms of CO2 equivalent per euro of economic output for that sector, emissions are estimated by multiplying spend by that factor. So simple. So you know how much are emissions based as the kilograms of the CO2, and you just put it the number based on that one. And of course, these multiplying numbers are a range, but you usually will have the choice to go with the range that you want. But of course, as a rule of thumb, usually the people go with the higher spectrum because they are just don't want to lose anything in the spectrum. So it also, the Scope 3 standard emphasizes that companies should use the most representative and accurate data available and improve data quality over time. That's one of the things. If you guys are in the SBTI, for example, annually you guys will check. First, you will have a target for your 15-year and for the 2013 and onwards. And then each year you will give the reporting how you processed, how much you guys reduced the emissions, and how much your company have processed your emissions. That is one of the most important parts, to know your emissions and calculate them. So to knowing the most accurate data, it also requires companies to assess data using the criteria such as technological representativeness, geographical representativeness, temporal representativeness, completeness. That is one of the most important ones, that it really needs to be as much as accurate and complete, and the reliability. The objective is transparency and continuous improvement. As I mentioned, for example, if you guys are following the SBTI or even in the EcoVadis. So going to the reporting requirements. I'm sorry. For the reporting requirements, the Scope 3 standard defines minimum reporting requirements. If a company reports Scope 3 emissions, it must disclose total Scope 3 emissions separately from Scope 1 and Scope 2. It must also report emissions by category. For example, a company might report that their category 1 purchase goods and services have 200,000 tons of the CO2 equivalent. In category 4, upstream transportation, 15,000 tons of the CO2 equivalent. And category 11, use of sold products, 1,200,000 tons of the CO2 emissions. It's a normal for any factory-based company, product-based company, product manufacturing company. If a category is excluded, this company must explain why. For example, a consulting firm may exclude category 10, the processing of sold products, just because it does not sell intermediate goods that require further processing. So that will be okay. Your company is active, no issues. You may not have emissions in all the spectrum. That is okay in the 15 categories. There is no issue on that one. The company must also disclose the calculation methods for each category, the data source and emissions factors, key assumptions, the organizational boundary approach, the base year, which is really, really important, selected, and any recalculations due to structural changes or improved data. The standard emphasizes transparency. It does not require every category to be materialized, but you have to be most relevant and must be assessed and exclusions justified. Because basically, whatever your company has, whatever system of the standard your company processing, it would be the SPTI, CDP, or the RA100, your company will be compared at the end of the reporting cycle with another companies. And you guys, of course, will be graded as in the general comparison. And on that one, your company will realize how good or bad your reporting has been processed, and how good or bad your company has done your job as the people in the departments of the sustainability. So one thing which I need to really make sure regarding the base year selected, your company can choose their base year selected. It could be 1 year ago, 2 years ago. Whatever you guys have the data for your company, and that date here will be important, as you will have that date here up to the 2013, which is all the companies first of all, and of course 2045 and 2060 based on the country and other specifics. But that base year that your company is choosing, you should have almost all related emissions, or the main ones. At least you'll generally companies have the scope 2. That's a general rule of thumb. But the other emissions, as it takes time and everything, that could be something that they could use as assumption for whatever their emissions has been. So going to last slide before we go into the questions. I know we are short on time, but I just feel I need to mention something. There are some challenges, as on the previous slide, I should have mentioned that in the accounting for value chain emissions, a global, for example, if you count as a global retailer, may source from thousands of suppliers, Amazon, AliExpress, if they count, obtaining primary emissions data from each supplier may not be feasible in early reporting years. Of course, that's understandable. And the second, double counting across the companies. For example, emissions from cement production that will appear in the cement manufacturer scope 1 inventory, and in the construction company's scope 3 category 1 inventory. The standard clarifies on the GHG protocol that this is acceptable across different companies. What must be avoided is the double counting within a single company's inventory. So in order to just saying in a plain words, if my company, as emission scope one as a supplier to a retailer, I have a scope one and accounting and I report it and I take care of those. My scope one will be the scope three of the another company retailer. So they also count my emissions and take care of those as the carbon credits or the other means that they are taking care of. So that's said, and the fourth, the estimation of uncertainty. When using spend-based emission factors, results depend heavily on how representative those economic intensity factors are for the specific goods or services purchased. And that's a really important one. And of course, the fifth one would be the supplier engagement. Improving the scope 3 accuracy often requires collaboration with the suppliers to obtain better primary data over time. I know it's a really, really tough job. And I can tell you, every other week I have this trouble with the clients that they are saying, okay, we cannot just collect this information. They are not responsive. They don't reply according that we are looking forward. They don't have the people and all of those. I know. Everyone knows that. We are all in the same front in this one, but we have to push. Whatever you guys can, you can try to make sure that they can provide this information. Or if you can, unfortunately, you can change your supplier. That's the last resort that you can take. But even threatening that threat, they usually comply and come up with them processing their data and prioritize to that. So scope 3 at the bottom line will be that scope 3 standard emphasizes that while uncertainty exists, companies should prioritize completeness, consistency, and transparency as much as possible. Scope 3 accounting is designed to improve understanding of the value chain, those emissions involved in that, and identify those opportunities for emission reductions. That as much as you reduce, you'll be ready for your goals towards 2030 or onwards. So thank you so much. I try to cover as much as possible, but I'm open for if there are any questions or anything I can address with.